When Luis Freddy Lala Pomavilla reached the military checkpoint in Tamaulipas, he was bleeding from the neck and barely able to speak. He had walked out of darkness, across open ground, past the place where everyone else from his group had been left behind. The soldiers in front of him did not yet know they were standing at the edge of one of the most notorious migrant atrocities in Mexican history. Luis did. He was 18 years old, far from home, and alive only because, when the gunfire ended at a ranch near San Fernando, he had managed to stay still, wait, and then run. He had started in Ecuador, one more young man heading north toward the United States through a route already feared for kidnappings, extortion, and disappearances. By 2010, migrants crossing Mexico were moving through a country where criminal groups increasingly treated them as cargo. Human rights organizations had warned for years that migrants were being kidnapped in huge numbers, held for ransom, forced into criminal work, or killed when they could not pay. Tamaulipas was especially dangerous. Los Zetas controlled key corridors there, and the highways toward the Texas border had become places where buses could be stopped and people could vanish. Luis was part of a group of migrants from several countries moving north through that landscape in August 2010. The victims later found at San Fernando included people from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Ecuador, Brazil, and India, among others, and Mexican authorities would eventually report 58 men and 14 women among the dead. The group had not set out to become a headline. They were trying to keep moving, the way migrants do when every delay costs money and every wrong stop can trap you. Somewhere in Tamaulipas, armed men intercepted them and took them to a ranch in the municipality of San Fernando. According to Luis's account, the captors identified themselves as Zetas. What happened next came into the public record largely because Luis survived long enough to tell it. According to his testimony reported at the time, the captors demanded money and also tried to force migrants to work for them as hitmen. The people in that group were not armed operatives, and they were not willing recruits. They were migrants already deep into a brutal route, now facing men who controlled the ground around them and expected obedience at gunpoint. When the captives refused, the situation became final. Luis later said he was shot but not killed. In the chaos that followed, he played dead, waited, and then slipped away. His escape was not simple. The reporting from the time and later investigations describe him traveling roughly 22 kilometers before reaching the checkpoint, wounded and desperate for help. He did not just save himself. He led the authorities back. On August 24, 2010, after receiving his report, Mexican Marines went to the ranch near San Fernando. There, after a confrontation that left one Marine and several gunmen dead, they found the bodies of 72 migrants. The discovery stunned Mexico and the wider region. Even in a country already used to cartel violence, the scale and the target stood out. These were not rival traffickers in a gun battle. They were migrants trying to get north. Luis became the sole known survivor of the massacre. For a brief moment, the world knew his name because without him, the ranch might have remained hidden longer, the bodies undiscovered, the story delayed or buried in the same fear that had already swallowed so many others along that route. He was taken under protection and treated for his injuries. Within days, reports said Mexico offered him a humanitarian visa, but he chose to return to Ecuador instead. That decision made sense. He had gone north looking for a future and ended up as the only witness to a mass killing. Staying in Mexico after that would have meant continuing his life in the shadow of the men he had escaped. The massacre quickly became more than a single crime scene. It exposed how thoroughly migrants had been abandoned on parts of the route north. Amnesty International and other groups pointed to San Fernando as proof of a system in which kidnappings and killings were not isolated accidents but part of a larger pattern of abuse. Families struggled to learn who among the dead were theirs. Identification was slow and painful. Investigations were patchy. The same region would become the site of even more horror in 2011, when authorities uncovered 193 bodies in 47 clandestine graves in and around San Fernando, another sign that the first massacre had not come from nowhere. Years later, the justice picture was still incomplete. Amnesty said in 2015 that authorities had not made public whether anyone had been sentenced in the killings. By 2022, Mexico announced convictions against 18 former Zetas in connection with the abduction of the 72 migrants, with sentences ranging from 13 to 58 years, but reporting noted that none of those convictions were for murder itself. Even after that, San Fernando remained a case people cited when they wanted to explain impunity in crimes against migrants. The horror was undeniable, accountability stayed partial. What made Luis Freddy Lala Pomavilla's survival so important was not only that he lived through something almost no one could survive, it was that his survival forced the crime into the open. He arrived at that checkpoint wounded, terrified, and carrying the only direct path the authorities had to the ranch. Because he kept moving, the dead were found. Because he spoke, the public learned what had happened there. Because he got out, San Fernando stopped being a disappearance and became a documented massacre. In stories like this, survival is often described as luck, but in his case it was also endurance, judgment, and the ability to keep going after the point where most bodies simply collapse. An 18-year-old migrant, hunted in cartel territory, had to become his own witness before anyone else would even know there was a crime scene waiting in the brush. The route that took him into Tamaulipas had been used by thousands before him. They boarded buses, changed vehicles, trusted guides, avoided police, feared thieves, and kept the United States in their heads as the point that made all the risk seem temporary. But temporary danger in northern Mexico had become something else by 2010. Criminal groups were no longer only taxing the migrant route. They were using it as a supply line for ransom, forced labor, terror, and death. San Fernando became infamous because the number was so large and because one survivor made concealment impossible. Yet the larger lesson was that the massacre was not some unbelievable exception dropped into an otherwise normal journey. It was an extreme expression of a system of predation that had been building for years. Luis went home to Ecuador alive, but there was no clean ending inside that fact. He had escaped, yet the place he escaped from stayed with him, and the dead he left behind remained at the center of a case that Mexico never resolved cleanly enough to satisfy the families or erase the shame. What he did was enough to make sure the world saw the crime. That mattered. In cartel country, silence was often part of the method. People disappeared, buses emptied, families waited, and fear did the rest. Luis Freddy Lala Pomavilla broke that silence by reaching the checkpoint before he bled out or was found again. He turned a massacre that could have vanished into one that had names, numbers, and witnesses. And he did it while wounded, alone, and still moving north through one of the deadliest stretches of migrant road in the hemisphere. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.